The galaxy's apex predator cubs just replicated human anatomy using raw protein, and Dr. Velkith's calling an emergency council session because they've never demonstrated creative cognition before. The words hung in the air of the observation deck as 3 senior researchers stared at the security footage in absolute silence. On the screen, 3 Kithrin cubs, each the size of a full-grown Terran lion, with midnight black fur and bioluminescent stripe patterns that pulsed with their emotional states, had arranged their morning meal into something that should have been impossible. A human figure, anatomically correct, made entirely from raw meat. "Replay it," Velkith demanded, his crystalline Andromedan fingers trembling as they gripped the console. His species had spent 300,000 years cataloging predatory behavior across 47 galaxies. Kithrins didn't do this. Kithrins couldn't do this. The footage rolled back. There was Dinah, the human nutritionist who'd been assigned to the facility's cafeteria 6 months ago, visible through the reinforced observation barrier. She was making her lunch with the casual efficiency of someone who'd performed the same ritual 1,000 times. Bread, protein slices, vegetation, condiments, more bread. Simple, mundane. The cubs watched her with an intensity that made Velkith's circulatory fluid run cold. "There," whispered Thane, the grizzled Polarian behaviorist who'd authored the definitive text on predator cognition. His fur had gone completely silver over his centuries of fieldwork. "Mark timestamp 11:47:23. The largest cub, they're coordinating." The footage showed it clearly. The 3 cubs, who according to every documented behavior pattern should have been fighting over their food in a frenzy of instinct-driven aggression, were instead moving with deliberate purpose. One cub nudged protein slices into position. Another used its claws with surgical precision to shape portions. The third arranged smaller pieces with its teeth, creating details that made Velkith want to void his primary stomach. Fingers. They'd made fingers. "Initial assessment," Velkith said, forcing his voice into professional detachment even as his internal organs tried to relocate themselves. "How long did this take?" "From first observation to completion," the junior researcher's voice cracked. 17 minutes. 17. Thane's fur stood completely on end. "That's impossible. Creative cognition requires neural pathways that take millennia to evolve. Kithrins hunt by pure instinct. They don't plan. They don't create. They certainly don't." He gestured helplessly at the screen where the meat sculpture now had a recognizable face. "Engage in representational art." "Sir." The junior researcher's hand shook as he pulled up additional data. The cub's brain scans during the activity. The prefrontal cortex analog showed activity spikes we've never recorded in their species. Velkith studied the neurological data and felt his understanding of xenobiology begin to crumble. The patterns were wrong. Everything was wrong. Kithrins were apex predators from a death world that made Earth look like a vacation resort. They'd evolved to hunt, kill, and survive. Their brains were optimized for predatory efficiency, not abstract thinking. "Emergency Protocol 7, Velkith said quietly. "Initiate facility-wide lockdown. Contact the Xenobiological Ethics Committee immediately, and someone get that human away from the observation barrier before—" Sirs." The junior researcher had gone pale, which was impressive for a species that was naturally translucent. "The human. She's not at the barrier anymore." All 3 senior researchers turned as one. On the main screen, Dinah had moved to a table directly visible from the cub's habitat. She was sitting down with her sandwich, pulling out a personal tablet, completely oblivious to the fact that 3 of the galaxy's most dangerous predators had just demonstrated cognitive abilities that violated every known law of evolutionary biology. And the cubs were still watching her. "Why is she so close to the reinforced barrier?" Thane demanded. "That's her usual lunch spot," the junior researcher stammered. "She says the natural light is better there for reading." "Natural light?" Velkith's voice climbed an octave. "That's a Class 7 Predator containment unit. There's no natural. She thinks the simulation panels are windows." She's been sitting there every day for 6 months, sir. Velkith pulled up the long-range scans, hoping against hope that this was all some kind of horrible mistake, some cosmic joke that would resolve itself into normalcy. Instead, the data made everything worse. The cubs weren't just watching Dinah eat. They were mimicking her movements. One cub had arranged itself in a sitting position that eerily resembled human posture. Another had placed a chunk of its uneaten food in front of itself, not eating it, just waiting. The third was making small vocalizations that the translation software couldn't parse because Kithrans didn't have a language. They communicated through pheromones and violence. "Thane," Velkith said with the careful precision of someone trying not to scream, "in your 3 centuries of studying predatory species, have you ever seen anything like this?" The Polarian was silent for a long moment, his ancient eyes fixed on the screen. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone watching their life's work dissolve into meaninglessness. "Once," he said softly, "on Vega Prime, we documented a pack predator that began showing proto-cultural behaviors, tool use, social learning, delayed gratification." He paused, and his next words came out hollow. "It took them 11,000 years to progress from first observation to what we're seeing right now. These cubs have done it in the time it took that human to make a sandwich." The emergency communication console erupted with incoming priority signals. Velkith could see the authorization codes. This was going all the way up to the Galactic Council's Xenobiological Security Division. "Dr. Velkith," came the clipped tones of Administrator Quell, a Zentaran bureaucrat who normally dealt with paperwork, not existential crises. "We're receiving your emergency broadcast. Please confirm, are you reporting that Kithran juveniles have demonstrated spontaneous cognitive evolution?" "I'm reporting," Velkith said carefully, watching the screen as one of the cubs gently, like it understood the concept of care, adjusted a piece of its meat sculpture. "That 3 Kithran cubs have observed a human eating lunch and subsequently created a representational model of human anatomy using their provided nutrition. They are currently exhibiting behavior patterns that are impossible according to every established model of their neural architecture." Silence on the line. "Then, we're dispatching a full xenobiological assessment team. Estimated arrival in 4 hours. Until then, maintain lockdown protocols and do not, I repeat, do not, allow any further human interaction with the specimens." "Understood," Velkith said, just as Dinah looked up from her tablet and waved cheerfully at the cubs through the barrier. All 3 cubs waved back. Thane made a sound like a dying star collapsing in on itself. "They don't have hands," he whispered. "They're using their front paws. They've never used their front paws for anything except killing. They don't understand the concept of greeting gestures. They don't—" The largest cub padded over to its meat sculpture and very deliberately added another piece. Then it looked directly at Dinah and made a sound that the translation software, after a moment of confused processing, rendered as "friend." Every alarm in the observation deck started screaming at once. "That's not possible," Velkith said flatly. "Kithrans don't have the vocal structure for language. They can't. Their larynx configuration doesn't allow for—" The cub made the sound again, clearer this time. "Friend?" Dinah, still completely oblivious to the cascade of impossibilities occurring around her, smiled and called back through the barrier. "Oh, you guys are so cute. Yes, we're friends." The cub's bioluminescent patterns exploded into synchronized colors that matched the wavelength of human happiness. "Sir," the junior researcher said in a voice that suggested his reality had shattered beyond repair, "I need to report that the cubs have just demonstrated 1. Voluntary language acquisition, 2. Cross-species emotional recognition, 3. Synchronized social bonding displays, and 4. He swallowed hard. "They've stopped eating. They're waiting for her to finish first. Delayed gratification, social dining behavior, recognition of meal hierarchy. These were cubs that should have been fighting over food scraps with the single-minded violence of pure, predatory instinct. Instead, they were having lunch with a human. Velkith reached for the emergency evacuation protocols, his hands shaking so badly he nearly couldn't access the controls. "Prepare to extract the human," he ordered. "Full hazmat team, level 10 protocols. We need to get her away from those cubs before—" "Before what, sir?" Thane asked quietly. That was the question, wasn't it? Before the cubs evolved further? Before they learned more from simply watching a human eat a sandwich? Before the galaxy had to face the terrifying reality that humanity didn't just survive among apex predators. They accidentally taught them civilization? On the screen, Dinah took a bite of her sandwich, and all 3 cubs took a bite of their food in perfect synchronization. Then they started arranging the remains into what looked disturbingly like a table setting. "Get her out," Velkith said. "Get her out now." But even as he gave the order, he knew it was already too late. Whatever had happened in that habitat, whatever impossible cascade of cognitive evolution those cubs had undergone simply by watching a human prepare lunch, had already rewritten everything the galaxy thought it knew about predatory development. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered the truly terrifying question. If this is what happened in 6 months of casual observation, what would happen if the human actually tried to interact with them directly? He was very much afraid they were about to find out. The emergency extraction team arrived in full Level X containment gear, which was designed to handle everything from radiation storms to viral apocalypses. What they weren't designed for was dealing with a human woman who was annoyed about her lunch break being interrupted. "I'm sorry, but what exactly is the emergency?" Dinah asked, looking up from her sandwich as 6 heavily armored figures surrounded her table. "Did someone contaminate the protein synthesizers again? Because I already filed that report last week." "Ma'am," the team leader's voice crackled through his suit's speakers. "We need you to evacuate this area immediately. There's been a situation with the Kithran specimens." Dinah glanced toward the habitat barrier where the 3 cubs were pressed against the transparent material, their bioluminescent patterns flickering with what every sensor in the facility was now screaming was distress. "Oh, are the babies okay?" She stood up, genuine concern crossing her face. "Did they eat something bad? I noticed yesterday that the automated feeders were giving them the wrong protein ratios for their development stage. I adjusted it in the system, but—" "You adjusted their feeding protocols?" Velkith's voice cut in through the observation deck speakers, climbing several octaves above what was considered dignified for an Andromedan scientist. "Those protocols were established by the Galactic Council's foremost nutritional experts." "Yeah, and they were. Making the cubs constipated," Dinah said matter-of-factly. "I used to work at a zoo back on Earth. You can always tell when the big cats aren't getting enough fiber. The cubs were showing the same signs, so I— Wait, is that why everyone's freaking out? Because I changed their food." In the observation deck, Thane was pulling up the feeding adjustment logs with shaking paws. His eyes went wide as he scanned the data. "She's right," he said, voice hollow. "The protein ratios were causing digestive stress. The cub's waste analysis shows significant improvement after her modifications." He looked up at Velkith. "How did she know that?" "I just told you." Dinah's voice came through the comms, patient in the way of someone explaining something obvious. "I worked at a zoo. Lions, tigers, the occasional escaped crocodile. You learn things." "Ma'am, please," the extraction team leader tried again. "The situation is more complex than—" He was interrupted by a sound that froze every being in the facility. The cubs were crying. Not the aggressive vocalizations of predators. Not the territorial warnings that their species used to communicate threat. These were distress calls that sounded horrifyingly like the separation anxiety of infant mammals. "Oh, you poor babies," Dinah said, completely ignoring the extraction team and walking toward the barrier. "It's okay. I'm not leaving. These nice people are just being dramatic." "Ma'am, stop!" Velkith's voice was pure panic now. "Those are Class 7 apex predators. One swipe of their claws could disembowel a fully armored—" "They're 3 months old," Dinah said, pressing her hand against the barrier. All 3 cubs immediately pressed their paws against the same spot on their side, their crying stopping instantly. They're basically toddlers. Deadly toddlers, sure, but still toddlers. The facility's behavioral monitoring system exploded with data that made Thane's fur stand completely vertical. Impossible, he breathed. The cubs are demonstrating attachment behavior. True attachment, not pack bonding. They've imprinted on her. That's not how Kithran psychology works, Velkith protested weakly. They don't imprint. They don't form emotional bonds beyond basic pack survival instincts. They certainly don't. The largest cub made a sound that the translation software rendered as, "Dinah, stay?" Every researcher in the observation deck stopped breathing. Did that cub just, the junior researcher whispered, use a proper noun? In context? With grammatical structure? Yes, Dinah called back cheerfully. Dinah's staying. I just have to explain to these worried people that you're not going to eat me. Not eat friend, the second cub vocalized, its pronunciation improving even as they watched. Friends share food. They've developed language, Thane said faintly. Functional, contextual language. In 6 months. It took my species 400,000 years to develop language, the junior researcher added, sounding like he might need medical attention. The third cub, the smallest one, padded over to their meat sculpture and carefully picked up a piece. Then it pressed it against the barrier, clearly offering it to Dinah. "Oh, thank you, sweetie," Dinah said, her voice warm. "That's very thoughtful. I can't eat through the barrier, but I appreciate the gesture." The cub's bioluminescent patterns flickered with what the emotion recognition software identified as disappointment. Then, with deliberate care, it placed the meat piece back on the sculpture and adjusted it slightly. Velkith pulled up the detailed scans of what the cubs had created, and his circulatory system threatened to shut down entirely. It wasn't just a human figure anymore. It was Dinah, specifically Dinah. They'd replicated the pattern of her clothing, the way she wore her hair, even the small details like the identification badge that hung from her neck. And around this meat Dinah, the cubs had arranged their remaining food into shapes that, according to the pattern recognition software, represented the table where she ate lunch. They'd created a scene, a specific scene, a memory. "This is," Thane started, then stopped. Started again. "This is representational cognition at a level that rivals galactic species capacity. They're not just learning. They're creating culture. They're building shared memory systems. His voice cracked. "They're becoming people. They've been people this whole time," Dinah said, and everyone realized the comms were still open. "They're just babies. Smart babies, sure, but that's not exactly unusual. Have you seen what human toddlers can learn in 6 months? They go from babbling to full conversations. These cubs are just doing the same thing. Human developmental timelines are not applicable to," Velkith began. "Why not?" Dinah interrupted. "They're watching me every day. They're learning from observation. That's how kids learn. Species doesn't really matter when it comes to the basics." In the habitat, the cubs had abandoned their sculpture and were now arranging themselves in a specific formation. It took Velkith a moment to recognize it. They were sitting in the same triangular pattern that Dinah used when she played her tablet videos during lunch. She'd been watching cooking shows. The cubs had been watching the cooking shows. "Pull up the habitat's environmental logs," Thane ordered suddenly. "Everything the cubs have been exposed to. All audio, all visual stimuli, everything." The data flooded the screens, and Velkith felt his understanding of reality continue its rapid dissolution. The cubs hadn't just been watching Dinah eat lunch. The habitat's sensors had recorded them paying attention to everything she did. When she hummed while preparing food, when she talked to herself about her day, when she watched videos on her tablet with the volume just loud enough to carry through the barrier, they'd been learning human behavior as a second language. "How long?" Velkith asked in a dead voice. "Has their feeding schedule overlapped with her lunch break?" "Since she started working here," the junior researcher said. "She requested that specific time slot because," he checked the records, "because she thought the cubs looked lonely eating by themselves. Lonely. She'd thought the galaxy's apex predators looked lonely, and somehow, impossibly, she'd been right. The metabolic data, Thane said suddenly. Their stress hormones. Check their baseline stress levels before and after she started her regular lunch schedule. The comparison graphs made everything worse. The cubs' stress hormones had dropped by 47% since Dinah began eating lunch where they could see her. Their aggressive behavior incidents had decreased to 0. Their play behaviors had increased by 300%. They weren't just learning from her. They were healthier because of her. This is going to rewrite every xenobiological protocol in the galactic database, Velkith said quietly. Every single one. Sir, the extraction team leader called up. The human is refusing to evacuate. She says she needs to finish her lunch break and she's already late returning to work. Late returning to... Velkith's voice strangled itself. There are cosmic implications occurring in real time and she's worried about her shift schedule. Union rules, apparently, the team leader said helplessly. She gets 30 minutes for lunch and she's only had 22. On the screen, Dinah had returned to her table and was calmly finishing her sandwich while the cubs watched with rapt attention. When she took a sip of her drink, all 3 cubs drank from their water dispensers. When she wiped her mouth with a napkin, they very carefully cleaned their whiskers. They're not just learning, Thane whispered. They're synchronizing. They're forming a social group with her as the primary model. With a human, the junior researcher added unnecessarily. They're forming a social pack with a human. Technically, Dinah's voice came through the comms again. Apparently she could hear them perfectly well. I think they're forming a family structure. The big one is definitely the protective older sibling type. The middle one is the curious troublemaker, and the little one is the sweet, sensitive baby. She paused. You know, personality-wise, they remind me of my nephews. In the habitat, the smallest cub made a sound that the translation software rendered as Dinah family. And Dinah, this human who had accidentally catalyzed cognitive evolution in apex predators simply by eating lunch near them, smiled and said, Sure, sweetie, we're family. All 3 cubs' bioluminescent patterns synchronized into a color that the emotion recognition software had never seen before. It took the system 3 full seconds to generate a translation, and when it appeared on the screens, Velkith had to sit down before. His legs gave out. Pure joy. The galaxy's most dangerous predators were experiencing pure joy, because a human had called them family. Get me the Galactic Council, Velkith said weakly. All of them. Emergency session, and someone find me the human's personnel file, because apparently we've been employing someone who can accidentally domesticate Death World apex predators. Sir, the junior researcher said, pulling up Dinah's file. According to her application, her previous experience includes kindergarten teacher, animal rescue volunteer, daycare operator, and... He paused. She has a master's degree in developmental psychology with a specialization in cross-cultural learning patterns. Of course she did. Of course the human who'd rewritten evolutionary biology had a degree in how children learn. On the screen, Dinah stood up, collecting her lunch containers. Okay, babies. Dinah has to go back to work now, but I'll see you at dinner time, okay? The cubs made synchronized sounds of acknowledgement, their language skills noticeably improving even in the last 5 minutes. Dinah come back? The largest asked. Promise, she said, and the word carried a weight that made every sensor in the facility ping with significance. Because the cubs understood promises now. They understood future planning, delayed gratification, and trust. All because a human had treated them like people. The Galactic Council's emergency response team materialized in the facility's main conference hall exactly 93 minutes after Velkith's distress call. Leading them was High Assessor Pyth, a Luminaran whose entire body structure was dedicated to processing complex information, essentially a floating brain with sensory organs. Show me, Pyth demanded, bypassing all pleasantries. Velkith pulled up the compiled footage. The meat sculpture, the language development, the synchronized behavior, all of it. He watched Pyth's chromatic patterns shift through confusion, disbelief, and finally settle into something that looked disturbingly like existential dread. "The human is still in the facility?" Pyth asked. "She's in the cafeteria," Velkith confirmed. "Her shift ends in 2 hours. And the cubs?" Thane gestured to the live feed. All 3 cubs were arranged at their barrier, staring in the direction of the cafeteria. They hadn't moved in 40 minutes. They were waiting. "They've been like that since she left," Thane said. "We tried redirecting their attention with enrichment activities. They ignored everything. They're just waiting for her." Pyth's patterns flickered rapidly, the Luminaran equivalent of heavy calculation. "Pull up the neurological scans again. I need to see the exact moment of cognitive shift." The team compiled the data, scrubbing through 6 months of brain activity recordings. What they found made Pyth's entire form pulse with alarm. The cub's neural development hadn't been gradual. It had been explosive, punctuated by specific trigger events, each one corresponding to moments when Dinah had been present. Her first day, her first lunch near their habitat, the first time she'd spoken to them, the first time she'd smiled at them. Each interaction had sparked cascading neural growth that shouldn't have been possible without millions of years of evolution. "This isn't learning," Pyth said slowly. "This is transformation. The human's presence is somehow catalyzing rapid cognitive development. It's as if—" Pyth paused, pattern stuttering. "As if the cub's brains are rewiring themselves specifically to understand her." "Why?" Velkith asked the question that had been haunting him for hours. "Why would apex predators evolve to comprehend humans?" Thane's voice was quiet when he answered. "Because she treats them like they're worth understanding." On the screen, Dinah appeared in the corridor, heading toward the habitat for evening feeding time. All 3 cubs stood simultaneously, their bioluminescent patterns exploding with color. And every researcher watching realized the same terrible truth. They hadn't been studying how predators could learn from humans. They'd been discovering that humans could accidentally teach anything to become more than it was, simply by caring. Dinah walked into the habitat wing carrying a small container, completely unaware that half the Galactic Council was watching her through remote feeds. "Hey babies, I brought you something special," she called out cheerfully. The cubs pressed against the barrier, their vocalizations now forming clear, eager words. "Dinah back! Dinah back! I promised, didn't I?" She held up the container. "I made cookies during my break. Well, your version of cookies, protein treats with that nutrient blend you like." Velkith's mandibles went slack. "She made them food. She actually prepared food for them." That's maternal behavior," Thane whispered. "She's treating apex predators like offspring." Pyth's patterns went completely white. Pure analytical focus. "Open the habitat barrier. Let her go in." "Absolutely not." Velkith nearly knocked over his console. "Those are Kithrans. One miscalculation and—" "Look at the cubs," Pyth interrupted. On screen, all 3 cubs had arranged themselves in perfect sitting positions, their postures relaxed, their bioluminescent patterns showing patient anticipation. Not hunting poses, not aggressive stances. They were behaving exactly like well-trained pets waiting for permission. Waiting for her. "If we don't allow interaction," Pyth continued, "we'll never understand the full scope of what's happening. Besides," the Luminaran's patterns shifted to something almost like amusement. "I suspect the human will find a way in regardless of our protocols." As if on cue, Dinah pressed the habitat access panel. "The door's not opening. Is the system glitching again?" The cubs made distressed sounds. "Dinah, come in. Dinah, stay." She looked directly at the nearest security camera. "Look, I know you're all watching, but these babies are getting anxious, and anxious cubs don't sleep well. I'm coming in. Override the locks or I'm calling maintenance." Velkith looked at Thane, who looked at Pyth, who simply pulsed with what might have been resignation. "Override granted," Pyth said, "but we're maintaining full defensive protocols on standby." The barrier opened. Dinah walked in like she was entering a kindergarten classroom. not a containment unit for the galaxy's apex predators. All 3 cubs rushed toward her, and every weapon system in the facility armed automatically. Then the cubs stopped exactly 1 meter away, sat down in perfect unison, and politely extended their front paws. "Good babies," Dinah praised, distributing treats to each waiting paw. "You remembered the patience game." In the observation deck, Thane made a sound like his entire worldview was weeping. "She taught them manners," he croaked. "She taught Kithrin's table manners." The cubs ate their treats with delicate precision, nothing like their species' usual feeding frenzy. And Pyth quietly updated the council database with a single note: human integration protocols required for all predator rehabilitation programs. Immediately. Inside the habitat, Dinah settled onto the floor with her back against the wall, a position that would have given any xenobiologist a coronary. The cubs immediately arranged themselves around her in a protective semicircle, the largest positioning itself where it could watch the entrance. "So how was your day?" Dinah asked conversationally, pulling out her tablet. "Learn anything new?" "Learned waiting," the middle cub said carefully, its vocabulary expanding in real time. "Dinah always comes back." "Of course I do," she said, scratching behind its ear ridge. "That's what family does." The smallest cub nudged closer, resting its massive head on her lap. "Made something. For Dinah." It gestured toward their meat sculpture with obvious pride. "I saw. That was beautiful artwork," Dinah said warmly. "Very creative. Maybe tomorrow we can try using clay instead, less messy." In the observation deck, Velkith was frantically updating his reports. "She's introducing them to alternative artistic mediums. They're going to learn pottery. Apex predators are going to learn pottery." "The council is requesting a full cognitive assessment," Pyth announced. "They want to understand the mechanism behind this accelerated development." "The mechanism is obvious," Thane said quietly, watching Dinah show the cubs pictures on her tablet. Human children's drawings, he realized with a start. She believes they can learn. So they do. On screen, the cubs were now attempting to hold styluses in their claws, trying to recreate the tablet drawings on the habitat floor. Their motor control was improving with each attempt, their focus absolute. "Impossible," Velkith muttered, but the word had lost all meaning hours ago. Dinah's shift alarm chimed. "Okay, babies, Dinah really has to go now. But same time tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," all 3 cubs chorused, the word clear and confident. She stood, and they walked her to the barrier like an honor guard. At the threshold, she turned back. "Sweet dreams, you 3. Don't stay up too late practicing your letters." The barrier closed. The cubs returned to their sleeping area, where they'd arranged their bedding into 3 neat spaces with a deliberately empty 4th spot. Dinah's spot. "Final assessment," Pyth said, watching the cubs settle down with their styluses, still practicing. "Human subject Dinah has successfully demonstrated that cognitive evolution can be catalyzed through expectation, compassion, and consistent positive reinforcement. Recommendation: immediate implementation of human caregivers across all predator rehabilitation facilities." Velkith slumped in his chair. "She's going to want to bring her nephews for a playdate, isn't she?" "Probably," Thane agreed. In the habitat, the smallest cub carefully drew a stick figure labeled Dinah in increasingly legible letters. They were writing now. The galaxy would never be the same.